Thank you all for coming. I know on the printed agenda it says John Stead, but I'm actually Joe Stead. So if you were hoping that it was a really bad misspelling of John Skeet's name, sorry to disappoint. Yeah. So today we're going to be talking about something called the Blub Paradox and looking at frameworks beyond Microsoft. Now I know the title can be like a little bit provocative and it might seem very, very anti-Microsoft based, but if I wanted to make fun of Microsoft, there are easier ways to do that. I could spend an hour talking about something else, but I don't want to do that. I want to talk about frameworks. So the reason I want to do this, I think, is because we've spent so long talking, or in my entire career, I've spent so long talking about this thing, and it doesn't exist. So there's no such thing as a silver bullet. I got taught that in school, college, university, and throughout my entire development career, I've always said there's no such thing as a silver bullet. So it makes me wonder where my mouse is. Why we see things like this over and over again. I kind of spotted a trend pretty early on, and it's the same old. And by the way, it's just an hour of recruiter emails from now on, so have fun, guys. But there was a pattern I spotted pretty quickly. We're always talking about MVC, EntityFramework, SQL Server, and a few differences here and there, but it was the same stack in every single company, and it left me feeling like this. Because there is no reason that we spend, all of our time saying there's no silver bullet, and then using the same tools over and over again, just because it comes packaged with our IDE. Is that right? I don't think it is. And then I kind of did a little bit of reading, did some researching, and I kind of found this thing. And it's not an illegal move in a karate competition, because that would be cheating. So just saying, if any Karate Kid fans out there, the good guy lost. But what I did find was this thing called the Blub Paradox. And it's the secret weapon. So to put some kind of background to this, this guy called Paul Graham coined the term, I guess, when he was working in the mid-90s. He had an idea for an online store, an online marketplace where you can go sell things. Now, as a disclaimer, in the mid-90s when he was doing this, I was 4 or 5. So the landscape is a little bit different now, and it's hard for me to actually say this is exactly what it was like during the time. But when they were doing this online store called VOWeb, there wasn't anything else around like it. They were the first of their kind to the market, which kind of gave them a unique chance to really get this right and kind of beat all of their competitors to market, because nobody had the idea yet. So they had no idea what tooling was best to use at this point. They had nothing to work on. So they ended up using Lisp. Now, the reason they used Lisp is because this guy called Eric Raymond basically said, if you want to be a good programmer, use Lisp. If you want to learn how to get into code, Python, Java, great. If you want to administrate your servers and maybe a bit of Perl or some CGI scripts, but if you want to be a really, really good programmer, use Lisp. Okay, fair enough. So you may be thinking, what? I mean, I'm not a Lisp developer. I've never done any Lisp in my entire life, which I think you can tell because I've got the brackets mismatched on that. So, yeah, I'm not a Lisp guy. But the reason they had Lisp is it gave them a competitive advantage. So they launched their store called VOWeb, and then after some time they had a few competitors because people thought, oh, we can make some money out of it. So their version was written in Lisp, and then other people were using Java and Python and whatever else was around at the time. But as these competitors kind of showed up and surfaced, they had new features that VOWeb hadn't thought of, and they did things a little bit differently that customers liked. So to keep relevant, VOWeb also had to do those features. They were able to turn it around very, very quickly. The reason for that is because Lisp has a feature in it. Well, you have to be a good programmer to use Lisp anyway. But it's got a feature, or has a feature, where you can do macros in it. And at the time, that was quite a unique thing, I guess. And that allowed them kind of to turn around new features very, very quickly. And they were either a step ahead of their competitors when they arrived, or they were right behind them with a really, really quick turnaround. And you can't compete with that. So by beating competitors to market, you make more money, basically. And by staying kind of able to develop and iterate quickly and release quickly, you're going to continue to be successful. And it got to the point that I think it was late 90s, early 2000s, Yahoo bought VOWeb, And for a large chunk of time, it was the most profitable part of Yahoo. Now I don't know if there are any profitable parts of Yahoo, but they did good, basically. And it was because of their tech choices they made. They obviously had a good team around them. And they identified the tool that worked for them. So that's all well and good. They went with Lisp. It worked really well. They beat their competitors to the market, and they were able to stay relevant. But how do you identify what tool you should use? How do you know what's good for you and your problems? And what we're going to do is we're going to take like a little bit of a sidestep, and we're going to talk about languages and frameworks in parallel, I guess. So the languages that aren't very powerful and you know are really, really obvious to you. So an example for that would be if you compare C#7 to C#1. Now, obviously, you'd expect C#7 to be more powerful because it has, 15, 17 years of iterations and it's improved. It becomes a little bit more difficult when you consider, say, C# comparing it to Elixir or C# to Lisp, or even C# to Go. But you can draw parallels there. You can say, okay, my application, I need to kind of leverage generics really, really heavily to be effective. Don't use Go. Use C# because it's quite good at generics, or another language. So you can kind of draw parallels and pick out what's best for you by looking down all of the tech you know and saying, right, I'm at the top now, everything else is below me, not worth using. So that's great for the stuff you know. The problem comes with the stuff you don't know. So there's a big shout about FSharp. There has been on Twitter and online for ages. And as a C# developer, you may look at some FSharp syntax and think, the hell is going on here? And it's really confusing, and it's hard to follow and hard to read. But actually, it is strange, it is weird, and it is doing things you don't understand, but it's solving problems in a different way. So by learning, how FSharp works, you may think, actually, the pattern matching stuff in FSharp is much more powerful than pattern matching in C#. Maybe I can use this. But you won't know that until you actually learn it. Otherwise, you're going to look up and think, what's going on here? So you may be at the top of the stack and saying this is the best tool for the job here, but there's a lot out there you don't know. And it's important to kind of be aware that you don't know everything, and there are always alternatives. There are, of course, exceptions to the rule. Some languages and some frameworks are made just to mess with you. Don't waste too much time learning them for real business problems. For obvious reasons. And I think you can say the same about frameworks too. So a framework that isn't very powerful or very good that you've used before, you can identify it pretty quickly and say, no, this isn't going to be what I need. It's not good enough, I don't want to use it. But if you look at a framework that is new to you, it may be strange, weird, and do things you don't understand. Now the caveat here being, with a language it does things you don't understand because it's a different syntax. I'd expect using a framework to be quite simple and quite easy to get up and running. Otherwise, I'd be skeptical off the start. But it's okay. Just because you don't know how it works, it doesn't mean it's not very good. It could be more powerful than what you already know. And I would identify as a Blub programmer. So I don't know everything. In fact, I know very little, I would say. But that's where we are. So I'm going to quote directly from Paul Graham now in his blog post where he mentions the Blub Paradox. So, by induction, the only programmers to see all the differences in power between the various languages, or in frameworks in our case, are those who understand the most powerful one. So this is why Lisp makes you a better programmer, because it's more powerful than Java and Python, etc. You can't trust the opinions of others because of the Blub Paradox. They're satisfied with whatever language or framework they happen to use, because it dictates the way they think about programs. Now that is a really, really killer quote as far as I'm concerned. And we see it quite heavily. People have really, really religious debates about their framework of choice and how it's better than this because it's all I know and I've used it for 10 years. Why would I use anything else? That's not a very good argument. In fact, it's not an argument at all. It's just staying in your comfort zone and never learning anything new, which you should do. I mean, even if you go and explore FSharp for a little bit, you may come back to C# and write code in a little bit of a different way because you prefer how composition works over inheritance and things like that. There are values in learning new things and applying to what you already know too. Same way there are values in learning new frameworks and kind of using the patterns and techniques that they use and applying it to your current code too without having to adopt everything. So with that in mind, what I'd like to do now is kind of go through a standard tech stack and look at some alternatives to some common tools that are used. So we'll start with databases. just a disclaimer again, the stock images do get worse as the talk goes on. So what I want to do more than anything is talk about relational databases. So I could easily talk about NoSQL and document databases and things like that, but comparing those is quite difficult, I think, because they do things completely different. It's not a fair comparison to make. So on the relational side of things, there's, of course, SQL Server. Everybody seems to be using it, and nothing else. But there isn't. There's MySQL. There's Oracle, if you want to go down that route. And there's Postgres, too. And there are loads more. These are just kind of 4 I've picked out. So SQL Server is pretty heavy. It's Microsoft-based. It runs on Windows. Maybe, well, it's coming to Linux. When that's going to be production ready, I'm not 100% sure. Oracle, yeah. In fact, my first job, I was porting Oracle Forms, I think it was. So it was logic written in SQL, and I was porting that to be in C# and Silverlight. That job was mental. Yeah. So that's my only experience with Oracle. MySQL as well. It's cross-platform-ish. Just ignore how the file system works underneath if you don't want to see some weird results. But you can do some pretty cool things with it. I mean, look at what Facebook did with MySQL. They got up and running pretty quickly using a MySQL database, and they did some pretty cool things, and then they've kind of pulled that in and done some absolutely incredible things with graph databases and things like that. But, you know, Facebook's a huge company. And, of course, Postgres. So what I'd like to do is kind of take Postgres and SQL Server forward together, and we'll kind of compare them, talk about Postgres in a little bit more detail, and see how we think about that. So should you use SQL Server or should you use Postgres? Does anybody in the room use Postgres? Quick show of hands. Okay, cool. Quite a few people. Good. So the one thing I will say is ANSI SQL is ANSI SQL. It doesn't matter if it's Postgres or SQL Server. You've probably got enough of the skills already to translate and learn how to kind of query and write tables and things like that pretty quickly. There's not a huge barrier to entry. So ANSI SQL is just your standard set of language there, okay? It doesn't matter. You know this. This will run on SQL Server or it will run on Postgres, and it's going to be fine. So cross-platform. So SQL Server is coming cross-platform, to Linux at least anyway, but it's not quite there yet, though I have pulled down a Docker image with SQL Server in and run it on my Mac, and it was quite cool, actually. But it's not quite there yet. Postgres is. And containerization, and we have our first hipster point of the day as well, by the way. There's a prize if whoever counts how many hipster points there are through this slide. Prize at the end for you. So containerization. So again, traditionally, SQL Server couldn't be containerized. Now it can, because it's cross-platform, Linux, Windows containers, everything. One thing I will say is you kind of often see that people say, oh yeah, don't put your database into a container, it's a bad idea. That was before we had volumes. Okay, we have volumes now, it's much safer, it's okay, you're not going to lose your data, unless you don't set up a volume, I guess. But it's also really, really good for kind of local development too. So instead of clearing down your database with loads and loads of scripts, I can just kill a Docker container and bring it back up, and I'm fresh again. It's really, really handy. So going into more detail on Postgres, it is cross-platform. It just works. You don't really need to worry about it too much. If you're happier on Linux or OS X or Mac OS or whatever, it's fine. If you want to use Windows, cool. It's got some JavaScript in there. Now, you may be thinking, why on earth is a language that was designed in 10 days that runs in a browser in my database? We'll go into that, but you'd be right to be skeptical. You can store JSON objects. So I think in SQL Server 2005, it introduced the XML kind of column type, and you can use XPath to query the XML inside your SQL. I've worked on a system where I had to do that. I left quite quickly, actually. But that was crazy. And now I think in SQL Server 2014, maybe 16, you have JSON columns in there too, which is quite cool. A key value store as well. So, okay, at this point you may be thinking, well, we're talking about relational databases. What does a key value store have to do with that? We'll get to it. And then building on top of it as well. So the platform that Postgres gives us, what else can we make this database do for us? So jumping into it, we'll talk about the JavaScript stuff, because that is the craziest thing out of all of this, I'd say. So it uses the V8 JavaScript engine, which is what Chromium uses. So PL-V8 is procedural language, V8 is procedural language JavaScript. So you can run JavaScript in part of your queries. You may be thinking, why on earth would I ever want to have some JavaScript in my select statement? Well, if we consider that we have a JSON column type, and we're working with JSON objects, maybe you are interested in a particular field, and you can use that in your query. Maybe not. I would question what you're doing at that point, but you can do it. You can also have it in your indexes. So Postgres has this really, really neat feature called functional indexes. So with a functional index, you can, when you insert things, you can do things like convert case, and then when you query it, it'll already be there in the functional index. So you can do things with JavaScript in your functional indexes too. So again, if you've got a JSON column type, and you want to maybe index on that somehow, have a functional index to do some magic with JavaScript, and it's just going to work, so it'll be quick to read from too. Again, be careful with it. It is a browser technology in your database. I would use it liberally, and I would make sure that it's actually solving the problem I need. And we're going to have to talk about the key value store a little bit. So, in all honesty, it's not a relational database at this point. We're talking like Redis, React territory, and maybe you should use those. But there are cases where having features like a key value store built into your database is quite useful. So, for example, the company I work for at the minute, a lot of our deployments are on-prem, and we don't control the hardware that it goes to. We don't control what infrastructure they already have. All we know is we can have a Postgres database and somewhere to run our C# code. That's all I know. So if I want to use a key value store, then maybe I can leverage Postgres and do something pretty cool with that and save an extra infrastructure dependency. Now you may be thinking, okay, I opened up saying picking the right tool for the job, but sometimes pragmatism just has to win, and you've got what's there, let's use it. Sometimes it isn't. And yeah, if you didn't know what a key value store was, it was a key and a value. It's literally like a dictionary, I guess. And they're indexed, which means they're really, really quick to read from. I don't have exact performance stats on how it compares to like Redis and React and things like that, but it's quick to read from. So if you do need a key value store and you're stuck with your options and how many kind of external infrastructure dependencies you can have, maybe Postgres can help you out. Okay, and then there's this thing called Martin. So this is building on top of Postgres and what we can do with it. So you can use Postgres as a document database with Martin. You can use it as an event store with Martin. Now we're really, really out of relational territory. But, again, it's good to know about. There are uses you can have for it. So you may be saying, okay, if I want an event store, what's wrong with the Get event store, Greg Young's event store, N event store, things like that? And the answer is there's nothing wrong with them. They're great alternatives. But again, if you're constrained by what dependencies you can bring in, Postgres offers quite a lot out of the box for this with Martin on top, which is just a C# library. So it's still Postgres underneath, and we have our second hipster point. So Postgres is a document store using Martin. It's a C# library. It sits on top of your code, and it's still going to be Postgres underneath. So we're going to get some code, and we're going to kind of see this code quite often. So if you've ever used Raven before, it looks very, very similar to this. So we just have a user object. We store it in our database, and it's done. And underneath, that's going to be converted into a JSON blob of some kind and use some of the JavaScript stuff that we saw on the indexes really, really effectively to make this work quite nicely. I mean, there's nothing magic going on there. It is just a document store, and it's how you'd expect it to look. And then there's an event store as well. It's the same sort of thing. We have some events, and we save them. Now, if you've ever done event sourcing, this isn't how it actually looks, but it's a good example. It's not actually a good example because everybody knows that Frodo and Sam set off from Hobbiton, not Frodo and Merry. And Pippin is spelt wrong as well. Terrible example. But it shows the events kind of being added to a stream. You can append them, start the stream of events, things like that. And again, it just works. You have your streams in your database, and you have your events in your database. Underneath, it's probably still just JavaScript in Postgres to help you out. So Yeah, it's pretty cool. But as far as databases go, they're not the most interesting thing in the world. So let's move on to something a little bit more interesting. I'm clutching at straws a bit here, I think, with data access. Woo! So, to kind of talk about data access, we obviously have to talk about NDC a little bit. We're finally getting to some Microsoft technology again. We're getting closer to code. But we could also be using NHibernate, simple data. So simple data is something Mark Rendell wrote, and it uses dynamic method chaining and does some magic with SQL. I don't think it's still being maintained. It's quite a cool way of doing things. I think that's all that needs to be said about that. It's pretty cool, but yeah, it exists. And of course, Dapper as well. So again, we're going to talk about NDC and Dapper in a little bit more detail. I don't know much about NHibernate, though it's pretty crazy, and simple data is worth knowing about, but not in a huge grade of detail. Oh, and of course, FSharp type providers. So if you're in FSharp land, you can point your code at a database, and it'll figure out all the types in there, and it'll just do some magic. It's pretty cool. It's quite nice, actually. But I am not a very good FSharp developer, so I won't talk about that too much. A hipster too. So let's talk about NDC. And we kind of have to mention that it's linked. It's just your code that you'd expect anywhere else. And I'm sure most people, if you ever use NDC, know what it looks like, so there's no point in me showing you that. But what we do need to talk about is lazy loading. I have wasted so much time trying to figure out how lazy loading works in NancyFX and why my code isn't working properly. It's ridiculous how that works. But it's a feature, I guess, that causes hours and hours of debugging headaches. But it's a feature. Okay, fair enough. And the thing that kind of puts me off EntityFramework is you have no idea what it's doing to your database. Has anybody ever had a DBA come in and scream at them because you've just run the worst thing ever on their production database and you have no idea why? And it's because EntityFramework generated this horrible, horrible SQL and ignored all your indexes. Every time you write a query, okay. So you don't have control over your SQL, and it can annoy your DBAs quite easily. That's bad. Keep your DBAs happy.
Get rid of the DBAs.
Get rid of the DBAs. That's the alternative, and then grind your server to a halt for no reason. Get them drunk. Okay, so talking about Dapper, I guess, it's quick. It's really quick. So to kind of put some context on this, it's what Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange uses underneath to talk to their database. And it's written by the guys at Stack Overflow as well. So yeah, it's quick. And it will scale quite nicely. And it works with a range of databases, including SQLite, Server, Oracle, MySQL, Postgres, etc., etc. And the reason for that is it's just extension methods on the system data DB connection thing. So they just act as extension methods to that. So the connection stuff is still handled by .NET, I guess. And now, the reason I like Dapper is not just because it's quick, that's quite nice. You can control your SQL completely. So you write the SQL, basically. You know what's happening in your database, which keeps your DBAs happy. Yay, you don't have to buy them beer instead. You can just write decent SQL code. So if your DBA comes up and screams at you after you've been using Dapper, it's probably because you've screwed up and it's justified. Maybe. I mean, it's never justified to scream at anybody, but you get the point. SQLite's a bit hipster. Okay, so what does Dapper actually look like then? So to query an object out, again, standard SQL as a string, connect using an using a SQL connection, which is IDB connection, and the query async person part. This is where we get to the Dapper land. So this is what Dapper is. And we're kind of selecting our SQL, so we're selecting ID, first name and last name from the users table. The user ID is 15. It's parameterized as well, so we're protected against SQL injection. Cool. And then we're kind of getting a collection back out and then taking one out of it. Okay? And it's asynchronous if you want, or there are synchronous overloads. And again, if we wanted to update or insert data or maybe delete, it's the same thing, with the difference being we execute instead of querying. It's the only difference, really. Now, the argument I often get against Dapper and for NDC is what if I want to change the database underneath? What if I want to go from SQL Server to Postgres? And I'm not using ANSI SQL, so I'm going to have to go rewrite all of my queries. First off, if you're changing your database provider, good. Do go rewrite all of your queries, because you're changing it for a reason, and they do operate differently. So the way indexes work in Postgres are very different to how they work in SQL Server. I want you to feel the pain of every line you're changing, because you probably don't need to do it, for one. And two, if you are doing it, think about what you're doing. Don't just blindly hope it still works. There are different systems underneath. The other thing I hear about is, well, I don't like having SQL in my C# code. It's like, well, you're talking to an external service. You have to speak their language. If you talk to a web service, you deal with HTTP status codes. You deal with JSON or XML responses. That's not C#. You're having to deal with, you're communicating to something outside of your system. Speak its language. It's okay. And if your argument is then, oh, then I have kind of SQL all over my code base, I have no idea what's going on, maybe don't. Maybe organize your code better, as an idea. So the arguments against it, I don't really get them. It's okay. It's fine. And it's quick, too, and you've got control. Everybody wins. So, again, data access is what it is. You're querying a database. It's kind of, again, not too interesting. So let's talk about the really fun stuff. Yeah. Web. So this is kind of where I really want to get into things. And do you know how hard it is to find like a good stock image of like showing websites and stuff? There are none. So let's talk about web frameworks more specifically. So everybody knows about this one. Everybody's heard of it. A few people have heard of NancyFX or Nancy. Anybody used Nancy before? Cool, a fair few people. Awesome. How about swathe? Any swathe users? Cool. So swathe is like an FSharp thing. So I want to get rid of that for a second because it's 2017. So let's talk about ASP.NET Core instead. So, let's talk about the new stuff. We're in modern days. That's what we're going to do. We're going to dive into it a little bit. I'm going to look at more code and kind of compare all three of these a little bit more detail. I don't want to talk about the .NET Core tooling because that's a whole other talk. So yeah, let's talk about ASP.NET Core. Now, the first thing I will say about this, is compared to Nancy, swathe, basically every other piece of tech that I mentioned, finding code that I can take from their documentation and show off was really difficult. I found lots of screenshots of Visual Studio. I found lots of screenshots of Postman. I didn't find any code. That's a little bit worrying in my opinion. I found some eventually, and then I write my own because I didn't like it. So a controller on ASP.NET Core looks like this. And it's fairly simple. We have an index method, and we return 200 with hello. The first thing that strikes me about this is, how do I know the root for that off the bat? I have to set up my roots externally and use some convention-based magic, and this will be running on localhost/hello, because hello is in the controller name, which is a bit strange. And then if I do just slash, that's index. If I do /details, we go to the details method. But if I want an explicit root or to use the delete, the HTTP verb, I'm using attributes. Now, that's okay, that's fine. You can be up and running really, really quickly with it, and there's nothing wrong with it. I don't want to say don't use it just because it's written by Microsoft. That's a ridiculous argument. But it is a little bit confusing when you get to the routing side of things and how it's actually working. I was trying to explain this to a junior developer who's never done any web development before. And I was trying to explain, well, the details method is part of the URL. And it's kind of a hard concept to get your head around in an OO language where you're using convention-based magic on the methods and things like that. But once you learn it, you can be pretty productive with it and get up and running quite quickly. And that's okay. So I guess the bit missing here is all of the other stuff in ASP.NET Core. So the middleware side of things, the hosting side of things, that's quite pluggable. It's quite a nice framework, so there's no point talking about that. I mean, that'll be shared with Nancy, for example. But as a controller goes and actually handling your web code, that's what it's going to look like, something like that, with potentially more happening rather than just returning hello and why not. But most people know what a ASP.NET MVC controller looks like anyway. So let's talk about swathe. So for those who don't know, swathe is an FSharp library. So we're going to get a little bit functional for a bit. And it looks a little bit like this. So unlike Nancy and unlike ASP.NET MVC, this is my entire application. This is everything I need, and I can run this, and it will fire up a web server. And we can see quite easily that it's using explicit routes. There's some custom operators in there, which we don't have to worry about. That's OK. But we can read it quite easily. So we're saying, OK, if we've got a get, choose one of these paths, hello or goodbye, and then return OK, and hello get or goodbye get. And it's quite explicit to see what's going on. And again, if it's a post operation, we do the same thing, except hello post and goodbye post. And again, it's really, really easy to explain, especially to a junior developer. There's no magic going on there. OK, there's a custom operator and a couple of keywords like choose, you might not know what they mean. But it's really easy to see that we have this route, and we do this thing. So in this example, it's just returning hello get or goodbye get, a string. And that may look a little kind of simple, too simple in fact. But the thing is, all you're going to do is call out to a different function and do your logic there anyway. You want to move away from the web side of things when you get to your domain logic. So it's fine. Use it. Move away from it. It's OK. And again, like I said, this is an entire application that's running in, 13 lines of code-ish? And that's your web server with routing, quite explicit, responses. It's fine. You don't have to worry about what the custom operators mean. It's fairly obvious. And that is swathe in a nutshell. Again, I'm not the world's best FSharp developer or even very good at it at all, so I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but it's a pretty cool alternative. And you kind of see how we build up routes here. Actually, maybe I can be more productive in this way of thinking. And that leads me on to Nancy a little bit. So I do have to plug Nancy because I really like it. So I'm a little bit biased here. So if we talk about the Blub programmers thing, they're never going to tell you use anything different. I'm doing that with Nancy now, disclaimer. But it gets out of your way. It lets you do things how you want to do things. So what I mean by that is it doesn't force you down any particular route. So if you don't want to use MVC, which is a pattern, by the way, you don't have to. You can use however you want. It's also really, really nice to test with. So with your unit tests, you can hook into Nancy, have a browser object, and kind of simulate going down some routes. Make sure your routing isn't broken. And that's out of the box. It works really nicely. So what you may want to do is simulate your routes and go all the way down across every layer of your code and mock out the database part. You've got some really, really quick unit tests where you're testing most of your logic. I would still be an advocate for running full integration tests, end-to-end tests, because the web stuff is quite weird, but it's good to know about. And it runs on .NET Core. Now, I really have to plug this because this is something that I'm really proud to say. The company I work for funded full-time development on Nancy to port it to .NET Core. We paid open source developers to get this working. I wish there was... Thanks. I wish there were more people out there. We were really, really invested in it to the point that we kind of decided we're running on Mono at the minute. We're hitting a few issues with seg faults here and there. It's causing us headaches. .NET Core is a thing. What do we need to do to get up and running on it? So we paid somebody full-time to work on it for a few months. I don't know. I don't know how long. And yeah, it means we're cross-platform with less seg faults in Linux land, which is great. So yeah, BQ Communications is a shout-out there. Really good company. Cool. So moving on to a bit more of Nancy's stuff. It's got pipeline hooks. So you can do things before requests, after requests. You kind of expect that in most frameworks, but it's got it. And content negotiation. Again, you've got that in ASP.NET MVC and things like that too. But the way it works in Nancy is I kind of prefer it a little bit. We'll see a code demo in a second and dive into that a little bit more. And it's highly, highly configurable. So it comes packaged with a IOC container. It was doing this way before Microsoft did it in ASP.NET Core. It's not a new idea. But if you don't like it, you can swap it out for your own. If you don't like the serializer it uses, you can swap it out. If you don't like anything about it, you can swap it out. It's quite easy to get into. And it has a really, really helpful community. So it's active on GitHub, issues, PRs, responded to. But the Slack team is quite handy too. So not only did my company that I work for currently pay for it to be ported to .NET Core, I also got my job through posting in this Slack team saying, anybody know of any cool jobs? Turns out, yeah, they do, and now I've got that. So it's a really, really nice community, and you might get employed by it, who knows? So let's look at some code a little bit and see how it compares to Swathe and see how it compares to ASP.NET Core MVC API thing. And this is kind of the equivalent of a controller in MVC land. It's a module. But one thing you will notice is the roots are a little bit more explicit, kind of like Swathe. So unlike ASP.NET MVC, we're not going to have to go to /hello/ to get hello get. We can just go straight to the root of our app because that's what the root is. We can put a root on the module saying, okay, I want it to start with this before I start responding to things. So we could have a base kind of base constructor call to add a prefix to the URI, but in this instance we don't need to. And you'll see we're just calling methods to register our roots. We're calling a get method to handle get requests. We're calling a put method to register a put request. And again, when you're explaining this to somebody who has no idea how any web frameworks work, it's quite explicit, it's quite easy, and it's kind of like an OO pattern as well. You're setting up everything this module needs in the constructor. You're not letting some magic happen, and there is a bit of magic underneath to actually get this working, but when you read it, it's quite clear and it's quite explicit. And you'll also notice that in the update method at the bottom, we're returning a dynamic type. That's because Nancy is based on Sinatra, which is a Ruby framework, and Ruby's obviously very dynamic. So there's some dynamic stuff in there, but that's okay, because it means we can return a status code of no content when we're just processing data. We can return an object, and that'll get translated to a status code of 200, and it'll be serialized using whatever the accept header is, because the content negotiation is kicking in and handling that for us. We can return views if we want. And it's okay, it's fine, it just works. One other thing to mention, I guess, is the root constraints. So on the second get method, we have an ID parameter in there, and we're saying, okay, it has to be of type int. So if we do /45, we will get, hello, I'm a number, and then 45 back. If we do /Joe, you'll get a 404, because it's not a registered root. So we've got constraints in there. We've got parameters in there that we can pick up and use, and it just works. So to me, it's clearer what's happening there than it was in ASP.NET MVC, but I am incredibly biased. So, but it's good to know about. It's good to know that I can do things a little bit differently. And you may kind of want to change this a little bit and make it look more like MVC. Sure, do it. Extend it. Build on top of it. It's fine. Use the lessons you learn from elsewhere and kind of build something together that works for you and solves your problems. And that kind of is all I want to say on the web stuff. What I do want to talk about in a little bit more detail are the different .NET languages. So I really, really struggled to find a programming language stock image for this, so I went for normal ones instead, because apparently stock images are hard to find. I don't know. So let's talk about the languages in .NET. Now, everybody knows C#, right? Is there anybody in here who doesn't write in C# or never has written in C#? Yeah, cool. Nobody. Everybody knows about FSharp, because as soon as you say C#'s better, you'll have 100 people telling you you're wrong. And VisualBasic as well. It is part of .NET. VisualBasic. No, let's bring it back, because VisualBasic is worth talking about. So FSharp's really, really good at pattern matching. C#'s good at taking the good features from FSharp. But VisualBasic has some features that C# and FSharp might not have too. So prior to C# 6, exception filters were not a thing in C#. They were in VisualBasic. And exception filters can be quite powerful. So it's really, really handy to know that VisualBasic does have features that your language might not. So don't write it off just because VisualBasic. It might actually help you solve your problems. Maybe. So what I've done is I've written a little kind of noddy app, and I want to compare how that looks across a few different languages. So C# being the obvious one, because everybody knows C#, so we'll start with that. So all I'm doing is I'm creating a new person object with a first name of Joe and a last name of Stead. I know what you're thinking. Are you using a constructor and it's not to inject dependencies? Who knew? You don't have to use object initializers. Constructors are a thing, guys. Let's use them. I'm formatting a name by using string interpolation, and then I'm printing it out to the console. Really, really simple. Except it's not. There's more code. Here's what the person object looks like. So I've really struggled to get this into one slide because there's so much code. But yeah, standard C# code. There's nothing fancy going on there. Okay? And it just works. It's quite easy to read, and there's a lot of it for what it's doing, I think. But there's nothing fancy about that. Everybody knows C#. Well, I presume everybody knows C#, and you're seeing that, okay, that's really, really simple code. I'm not really interested in it. But let's compare how that looks in FSharp. Now, again, I'm not a great FSharp developer, but this is what I was able to throw together. It's 4 lines of code, and it's doing the same thing. So we're creating a record type. We're having our function to format the name. We're creating a person object, and then we're piping it through. And it does the same thing. And this runs, by the way, the same as C# runs. The only difference being is I ran this as an FSharp script, so I cheated a little bit. If I wanted to make this at an entry point, I think it's an extra line, maybe 2 lines, to tell the compiler where to start. And that's it. So the key differences here, I think, is you can see type inference working quite well with FSharp. It removes a lot of the fluff. I've got the names the wrong way around. C#, string interpolation is probably a little bit nicer. I don't know if there's a better way of doing it in FSharp. There probably is. And some of the function names may not be as nice to read, but it's doing the same code. It's doing this. It's same input, same output, and it's 4 lines of code compared to however many lines of code that is. So much I couldn't fit it on one slide. So again, I'm not an FSharp developer. I do write C# full time, but by learning some kind of functional things in FSharp, I've actually supported myself writing C# very, very differently now. Now, you may just think, oh, go use a different language then. But actually, no, I like C#, I like .NET. But the way I'm kind of composing my methods in C# and the way I'm using funcs more and stuff like that, it's because I've done stuff in other languages and it makes more sense, but I can't commit to doing it full time because I have a 15-year-old code base written in C#. I can't just convert that to FSharp and have all of the nice features I want. But by learning it, I'm doing things differently. And that's useful. So how does that look in VisualBasic? Yeah, I don't know. I have never written a line of VisualBasic. Though I got offered a VisualBasic job once, even though I said I'm not a VisualBasic developer. That was quite nice. I said no. So, yeah, I don't want to talk about VisualBasic because I don't know it. And at this point, you may be saying, okay, hold up. I started off by saying, let's find the best tool for the job. Lisp worked really well for ViaWeb because they were able to have a competitive advantage of the language features that gave you. So why have I just spent the past 45 minutes or so talking just about .NET and just about kind of databases to be used with .NET? And you'd be right to ask that question. Is .NET always the right tool? Yes. No, the answer is no. So I like .NET. I'm not advocating kind of leaving it and going to try something new. But there's a lot out there. And in the world of microservices, maybe we can start looking at things like Go or Node. Elixir, use Elixir. Elixir's really good. Haskell Closure, Elm, Hacklang, Has anybody used Hack, by the way? No, it's the type system on top of PHP. Yeah, maybe not PHP on that one, but there are some really good alternatives out there. And in a world where we're moving more and more to microservices, who says that all of your code has to be written in the same language using the same database on every single one of your services? Pick the language that works best for you, and it does the job that you need, not because it's what you're comfortable in. Step out of your comfort zone, and you'll see there's a lot more out there. And this is just a sprinkle. There's not a huge amount on this slide. There are thousands of alternatives out there. Go check some of them out. Worst case scenario, you go back to C#, you go back to .NET, you go back to NTFramework with a different view on how things are working, a different approach to the problems you're trying to solve. So I guess the message here is understand when you're looking up at things that you don't understand, are a little bit weird, confusing, and why'd I touch that? And understand when you're looking down and say, okay, I'm 100% confident that this is the best tool I could be using right now. If you're a JavaScript developer, be careful, because that changes daily. You won't get anything done. But more importantly, understand when you should be looking up and when not to bother. Make sure you're still delivering value to your business whilst improving the way you solve your problems. Otherwise, you will stagnate and you'll learn all of these cool technologies, but deliver nothing. That's bad. Don't do that. And on that, I would like to say thank you very much. I'm Joe Stead. I'm going to be around at the party later for anyone else to come chat to me and ask me why I want to use so many hits technologies. Feel free to come say hi. Thank you.